Welcome to another episode of the Historical Movies Podcast, the podcast all about movies inspired by history. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter Bryce Evans. Bryce, how are you doing?
Very good, tally-ho.
Over the top.
Yeah.
Chin up. Yes, because in this episode, it's down to Gehenna or up to the throne, he travels the fastest who travels alone. It's 1917. So, directed by Sam Mendes, set on the 6th of April 1917, ostensibly a one-shot movie, Bryce, or a two-shot movie maybe I should say, because we have that break in the middle where the main character, Lance Corporal Schofield, is unconscious. But this movie is actually there's at least 35 cuts in it, and the longest take is 8.5 minutes. But that shouldn't break the idea, the immersion that this film gives, that it's a one-take affair. And it plonks us straight in the front lines in 1917. And it's a style that puts the focus on the spectacle, the action, and the experience. And I think this is one of the best action movies I've seen for a very long time, and especially considering that style, which I'll come on to later, the idea of one-shot movies. It functions brilliantly as an action movie. It's an action movie first, and it's a war movie second. There are some scenes, like there's the tunnel escape scene, the scene when they jump in, when Lance Corporal, Schofield jumps into the river. It's clearly an action movie. There are some other wider themes that you may expect from historical inspired war movies, particularly First World War. I'm thinking of Paths of Glory, the Stanley Kubrick movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. Schofield does mention that he traded his medal. There's the end scene when the guy's brother dies. But this is a movie that is focusing on the action, and I think it does superbly well in that respect, and I really enjoyed it. What did you think of it, Bryce?
Well, yes, on the one hand, agree, it's a very good yarn. It's, to quote my favourite Sude's Corner hyperbole machine in The Guardian, Peter Bradshaw, it's amazingly audacious in its one-shot nature, the single take. It's daring, it's adventurous, it's bold, it's immersive, which I believe is a current trendy term for this kind of filmmaking.
Yes, yeah.
Also, I don't like it at all, and I actually really do not like this movie on many levels, and I'll sort of elaborate on that as we go forward.
Brilliant. Well, we'll have a good debate then, I think. Well, I wanted to start on the one-take movies because Quentin Tarantino, I saw on a podcast, said his main problem with this movie was that he didn't think that idea worked. He said you either go for 15, 20-minute takes, like really long, hard takes, or you just don't try it at all. And it brings me back to the start point of one-take movies, which is Hitchcock's 1948 film Rope with Jimmy Stewart, a film that Alfred Hitchcock described himself as an experiment that didn't work out, and it had mixed critical reviews. A lot of people said it was a gimmick. And the reason why Hitchcock said that is because when you go for a one-take movie like this, you sacrifice so much in the editing, in the ability to cut, the ability to go to close-ups, the ability to go to from a close-up to a wide, the ability to show a lot of emotion. And this film goes all in on the... I actually disagree with Quentin Tarantino. I think this does function really well as an action movie, despite the short takes. And you have to... Well, I say you have to. You don't have to do anything. I think the best way to watch this movie, the where it wins for me, is when it focuses on the immersion, and that's kind of like when I watched this movie, as some other people have said, it felt a bit like a video game. And it's that kind of feeling, and it's not. It's a quite a modern cinema thing that we focus. A lot of modern films now focus on the spectacle and the experience rather than maybe focusing on the other great themes. And especially when you're doing a war movie, you could argue that's perhaps not good enough. You have to maybe involve some of the other more dramatic points, the more tragic things, the more ridiculous things about the First World War. What was the whole point of this this conflict that I'm sure we'll go into? You have to try a bit harder to include them. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, though. I think you may agree. You probably agree with that view maybe a bit more than I do. I think this works great as just an action movie. I watched this as a pure action movie.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, on that level, I mean, look, I had some of my notes here. I was going to say the movie, in some ways, tries to make the First World War a worthy war, which it wasn't. On the other hand, actually, let's just leave that all aside. It's just a good yarn. It's a ripping yarn. It's an adventure movie. So I can totally sort of strike that off in some ways. But the point you made there about it being a video game, a lot of the points I'm going to make, actually, are not mine. They're actually... never have I watched a movie and then read reviews where I've thought, yes, I really agree with that review. Frequently I read reviews and I think, maybe this, maybe not. I read a couple of reviews of this, one of which by Peter Subzinski, which absolutely addresses this issue of the video game. And I quote, "Sitting through it is like watching someone else playing a video game for 2 solid hours." And he further makes the point that the gasps for breath, where we get Mark Strong or Benedict Cumberbatch or Colin Firth, are like the cut scenes that separate different levels in video games. So perhaps, I completely agree that it is a video game, and I think it's the worst for it. It again, like, let's leave the point aside that it needs to be made. Nobody needs to be making a point perhaps about the hell of war. All Quiet on the Western Front, very recent movie, very much makes that point. The meat grinder, the horrid nature of this war. I can accept it's an adventure, it's a yarn. But I very much agree with that review by Subzinski there, that this feels so much like a video game that a lot is lost.
Yeah, it depends on the audience. If you go on YouTube, you'll find a lot of I'm sure our audience will know like Let's Play videos where people are happy to watch for hours someone else playing a video game. Not my thing personally, but that's there's an audience for that. Long format. People say that the youth of today have no attention span, but a lot of them are watching these long format Let's Plays through video games. Anyway, that's another point. But I see that point, but I actually it did distract me a little bit, but I enjoyed it. I mean, there are points in this movie where the action does get a little bit too crazy, especially that escape when they're in the bunker. It turns into like Indiana Jones at one point. I'm expecting a boulder to come out of nowhere and chase them down an alleyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is. It's Indiana Jones in the trenches.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. If we just come up with that.
I've just come up with that. That's mine. Yeah.
Brilliant.
But everything else I'm going to read is actually from other... Because, like I said, there's no other movie where I've actually read critical reviews and I've thought, actually, yes, I really agree with your damning verdict on this. So anyway, please continue.
It was pretty well received, I believe, by critics, wasn't it, on the whole? This movie, it was it did very well. It made 4 times its budget at the box office. Nominated for 10 Oscars, won 3: Best Cinematography, Best Sound Mixing, Best Visual Effects. Lost Best Picture to Parasite. Maybe that's a point here because Parasite's a movie that covers much deeper topics than maybe this movie touches upon. I don't know if it's better or worse. It's not trying to be a movie
very different movie, of course. I mean.
Yeah.
Could one of these reviews, which again I usually on this pod I have my own opinions, read reviews. I think I agree with 50% of that. I told you I read a review in the New Yorker by Richard Brody where I thought actually this nails in the head what I think about this film, and I'm going to quote it if I may: tasteless, gimmicky, full of patriotic bombast, melodramatic coincidences that grossly trivialise the life and death action by reducing it to sentiment. Schofield fills his canteen with fresh milk that he finds in a pail at a recently deserted farm and eventually feeds an abandoned baby with it.
Yeah.
And I read that and I think, absolutely, I completely agree with you, Richard Brody. And he goes on, the film is dedicated in the end credits to Lance Corporal Alfred H. Mendes, obviously the director's grandfather, who told us the stories. In honouring the recollections and experiences of his grandfather, Mendes remains trapped in the narrow emotional range of filial piety that, far from sparking his imagination, inhibits it. His sense of duty yields an effortful and sanctimonious movie. I agree with this review because I think this is the Spielberg, Christopher Nolan school of heroism, and it bores me. And it's the same story I've heard 100 times before. And I would like to doff my cap to Richard Brody because he's put it better than I ever could, actually.
Well, let me come back on that because I mean my problem with this film. I really like this film, by the way. I'm going to give it a high marks out of 10 score. So it'll be interesting.
Well, I ain't.
Stay tuned for that. But my problem with this movie is that it perhaps, which is perhaps unfair, is that it doesn't go into some of the deeper issues that war movies usually do. You know, I love war movies, and this doesn't quite cover it as deeply as I'd like to. But I think the other point I had, because I knew before I saw this movie it was a one-take movie, which for me as an editor rings alarm bells because I hate the idea. As you know, as coming back to Hitchcock, who said it was basically just admitted that he made a film that was a stupid idea, because you lose an unbelievable amount of control in the edit, in the post-production. You just have no control. You have to get everything spot on in the production, which is basically a stupid way to make a movie. So I was going into this expecting to be annoyed by it, expecting it to be frustrating, and I actually had a completely opposite experience. I really enjoyed it. I was really immersed, and I thought it was fantastic.
Here, it's a rollicking good yarn. Don't get me wrong. It's a rollicking good yarn. There's, it's your boy's own stuff. It's high octane. It's adventure.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And on those terms, fair enough. I don't want to come across as some sort of grouchy Guardian reader here. I think listeners to the pod
too late, Bryce. I think.
Well, I think listeners to the pod will sort of sense my disdain for the Guardian in general. Like, I'm not having this. My issue with this film is not, one of I dislike the British imperialism, or look, we've mentioned on this pod many times before. One of my least favorite things about historical movies is when they make knowing nods to issues that subsequently occur. And the best thing I can say about this movie is that it doesn't do this. We don't. He doesn't jump into a trench, and there's Corporal Hitler. It doesn't do that kind of thing. Actually, I'm just segueing on this, and sorry, this is going to sort of go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. But a great example of what I hate about we discussed last week in Titanic when there's a knowing nod to, this Picasso, he will never amount to anything.
Yeah.
A great example of that, and we're going slightly off topic here, but I'm reading I, Partridge by Alan Partridge at the moment. Alan Partridge's birth scene. A hospital room. A clammy pregnant woman lies spread-eagled on the bed. "Stand back," says the midwife. "Her contractions are massive. Get ready." And he goes on. "Looks like Anthony Eden's about to be named Prime Minister," mutters a nurse as she strolls past the door. "And Chelsea are about to win the First Division title," replies an orderly, almost certainly not educated enough to follow politics. In the corner of the room, "Rock Around the Clock" by Bill Haley blasts from the radio. So the best thing to say about this movie is that it doesn't make knowing nods to subsequent things that are going to happen, which is the cardinal sin of a lot of historical movies we discuss in this pod. No, this movie is better than that. It's original, it's adventurous, it's a ripping yarn, grand. It's just, well, actually, I'll tell you what my big issue is with this movie. It's when he gets to the end of his Odyssey.
Yeah.
And he eventually gets, and you're really rooting for him, and he gets to the trench. And then who do we have? Ubiquitous tough Benedict Cumberbatch. He, with the face of an English bull terrier, who turns to our poor Tommy and tells him, dripping in his upper class entitlement, "F*** off," or words to those effect. And that the whole piece just falls apart for me there. Well, it had fallen apart a lot earlier for me, actually. I just didn't like. I don't like the one take thing. I think it's cheap. I think it's gimmicky.
Well, yeah, that comes nicely onto a question I have. I just want to go over the history before. Actually, no. Let's go on to that one point first. The question that bothers me most about this movie is: would this have been a better movie if the attack order wasn't rescinded? If it went ahead at the end? If he went through all this shit in the trenches, got to Benedict Cumberbatch, and he just didn't pay attention to him? There is a point at which Mark Strong's character says, make sure there are witnesses, some men just want the fight. And I thought that was going to be a premonition, that he'll get to the end and he'll be unable to... Well, he would have gone through all of this journey and it effectively meant nothing. You know, it would have been a completely different film. It would have said quite boldly, you know, maybe we've heard this story 100 times before, probably for good reason, would have said quite boldly the uselessness, the futility of war. So the fact that Cumberbatch says "f*** off" is actually, I think it's actually a bit of a get out clause. It's not really harsh enough. You know, if it's kind of like patting the idea of the futility of war on the head, but not really respecting it.
Absolutely.
If the attack had gone ahead, I think it would have been a drastically different movie. I think it would have been a better movie.
This movie does not pay due deference to the futility of war, or in particular the futility of the First World War, which was the most futile, stupid of all wars. Instead, it sort of reverts to the notion that there can be like a sort of heroic narrative. Okay, there can be heroism, but the whole thing is futile, and I completely agree there. It doesn't, you know, what point is it trying to make here? Is this film just Sam Mendes just trying to, like, you know, there's nothing wrong with this, but, you know, trying to sort of do due diligence to his grandfather and his war stories? What's the wider point here of this movie? Well,
yeah, that's where I thought it didn't, just for my taste, that's where I wanted it to give a little bit more, particularly with those, because there are such brilliant films. I think Paths of Glory by Kubrick, which was absolutely, when it came out in the late 50s, 57 I think, was absolutely ripped to shreds by the military establishment and by a lot of critics. But I would say to people who haven't seen it, go and watch it. That's such a brilliant First World War movie. So it's all Quiet on the Western Front, but that's maybe a little bit more known now. Well, based on an original in 1930.
Yeah, the recent one, I think is Sorry, go on.
No, but then that maybe brings us on to the history. I'd like to get your thoughts on the First World War more widely. But it was quite interesting for me to read. There was a German operation in February and March 1917 called Operation Alberich, which was to shift the front line back to the Siegfried Line, or the Hindenburg Line as the Allies called it. So by shortening the front line by 25 miles, they needed 14 fewer German divisions to hold the line, which they did. When they were retreating, they had a policy that we see in the movie of scorched earth, destroying bridges, poisoning wells, killing livestock. The village of Bapaume was destroyed in 45 minutes, and 200 other settlements were also destroyed. So it was this great propaganda failure, which came to bite Germany in the ass when it came to the Treaty of Versailles, because this one operation was given as an example why they should have particularly punitive reparations, but it was tactically successful. But I mean, the movie does, if it doesn't, as we both agree, I think, doesn't maybe go deep enough for us in terms of war movies and what they can say about war, maybe it does do a good job of visualizing the horrors of the front.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Look, it's I suppose in some ways this comes down to, like, is World War One your thing or not? I mean, you know, I think probably a lot. I'll hold my hands up here and be self-reflective. I think I've a pretty jaundiced opinion on this, because I'm probably just so inured into the misery of the Western Front. I've heard the story a million times, and it just doesn't sort of gather me any kind of excitement anymore. You know, I know for some people it's their very identity, and it's their, you know, it's where their sense of nationalism or sense of identity sort of comes from, which I can completely relate to. I think for me, some of the best parts of this movie, probably because I could relate to, you can sort of watch parts of this movie and you can relate it to the kind of poems you've heard 100 times before by Wilfred Owen, or some of the brilliant novels about World War One, like Birdsong, which is a great novel about World War One and the sort of subterranean warfare there. There's aspects there where you can really relate to it. I just feel I maybe it's because I'm just sort of, maybe I find World War One so tremendously depressing. I find the concept of the notion of heroism within it very hard to come to terms to. Maybe I'm not being fair to this movie. In terms of its historical accuracy, look, the Western Front Association, who are the go-to people in Britain for World War One, read a review of this on the Western Front Association website, and they are people who often, nitpick about stuff about World War One, and they say the level of detail in kit, activity, parlance, and customs of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, is admirable. And I suppose you can't get a higher sort of endorsement than that from the
daddy of the World War One brigade,
the gatekeepers, shall we say, of the, and I don't mean that in a snide way, of World War One. It does that. It delivers. It's accurate. Like you say, the events are broadly accurate. Now, one of the broader issues with accuracy came to, I don't know if you're familiar with this debate, which sort of happened in Britain when this came out, in the sort of post-Brexit context, shall we say, of a Sikh soldier being. You familiar with this whole that?
Yeah,
that
and
seems to be the
there's also a few black extras and things like that some people were upset with.
Some people got quite agitated about that. Now, I don't know. I mean, I'll be quite honest. When I watched that, I thought, sort of, well, hang on, this was a segregated army. There were, huge amount of Sikh soldiers and non-white soldiers, fighting for Britain there, of course. But it was, of course, a segregated situation. I thought that was my sort of initial kind of accuracy issue here. But I think some people had an accuracy issue in the sense that, the historical memory for them is that this is a white war. I think actually for me, if we're going to get into this sort of the racial issue here, is that, well, it's actually, in the story of the movie, it's quite conceivable that a Sikh soldier could be there. I think they get in a truck which is picking up dribs and drabs. I think that's actually said in the movie. Yeah. So I don't really understand, unless you're sort of have a bit of a sort of racist agenda, why you'd kind of have a problem there.
I did read that I think a lot of the Sikh soldiers had been shifted to I can't remember, another theatre of the war. I can't remember where. Maybe at this point in 1917, but I think also the Sam Mendes' grandfather Alfred, I think, is from the West Indies. So I think his grandfather was a mixed-raced soldier serving on the front line. So I think that, I think that's a point to be made. I've read also about the segregation. I mean, some people are going to be convinced it's virtue signalling, which I don't know, perhaps it is. I'm not sure. Some people will say, well, that's, we have pictures of these non-white soldiers serving in white regiments and stuff. I don't know enough about it to make a comment, really.
Well, I think I suppose it's, look, you could, if you're coming at it from a sort of a left-wing angle, you could say, well, yeah, it's kind of virtue signaling in a way that's kind of trying to make World War One a worthy war, that it was worth something, that it was a noble fight that Britain should have got involved in, that it was worth something. Whereas, this war was tremendously destructive and it's kind of pointless in many ways. If you're coming from the right-wing angle, you would say it's virtue signalling in the sense that you're inserting non-white characters where they don't belong. Now, I personally think, we come back again, don't we, to the pedantry of historical movies. Is it conceivable? If the Sikh regiment wasn't at the particular coordinates shown at that time, is it conceivable though that a straggler, perhaps injured, was picked up? I think it wholly is conceivable. What's the issue there? I mean, but that seemed to be the fulcrum of the accuracy debate in Britain when this film was released.
Well, there's one other issue as well on talking about this, and that was there's a scene in the woods where the second Devons that Lance Corporal Schofield has been trying the whole movie to find, when he finally comes across them in the woods, some of the extras in that scene are really young kids. They look maybe 16, 17. And I thought that was really good because a lot of war movies, and actually most of the cast of the frontline troops look fairly young, the main two actors I'm thinking of. And I think you told me once about a book that maybe one of your colleagues had written about the kid soldiers in World War II and how that's such an underrepresented thing. I mean, particularly in movies. Where you have war films and everyone's, I mean, it's bad enough like in other films, but everyone's like 20 years too old for the parts that they're playing.
Yeah, I thought that was really good. I thought the young faces, again, that shows the horror, basically child soldiers, doesn't it? A lot of this, with a lot of this stuff, I'm very willing to, why would you be so caught up on certain very particular issues that you couldn't sort of broadly conceive of the fact that maybe things were somewhat chaotic. I think sometimes people get a little bit sort of myopic when they sort of try and chart certain regiments at certain points, and they think, well, a lot of the time this was chaos and brute murder on a horrible industrial ritual scale. And to be fair, it does capture that. Look, do we need another sort of war is hell movie? We perhaps don't. So I can forgive it its adventurous spirit for that, perhaps. For me, I come back to the original reviews I quoted, and the one shot thing. It feels a little gimmicky.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think for a second I'd be sitting here as an editor defending a one shot movie. That really surprised me. I just want to come back very briefly about World War I, Bryce, and just explain your view, which I agree with, by the way, that it was a futile endeavour. What made World War I a futile endeavour for our listeners?
Well, look, it's very easy in hindsight to say these things, but the sort of, when you look at the coming together of the great powers in World War I, to quote sort of Christopher Clark, who's one of the leading contemporary historians of that, the sleepwalking towards war of the great powers because of the failure of diplomacy, the alliance system, and then what that war became, contrary to everyone's expectations, this horrid 4-year, mudfest in Belgium, essentially. Yeah. I think few things act on our imagination more than this. The horror, the futility, what did it really resolve in many ways? In some ways, I suppose it led to the death of empires, the death of monarchies. In other ways, I suppose it created more problems. It's the origin of World War II, isn't it? I mean, so it's very, I suppose that's one of the difficulties of this movie in terms of, it's very clear cut. Look, history is not a morality tale, is it? But I think it's very clear cut, perhaps in World War II, that you're quite clear who are the goodies and the baddies.
Well, just coming back, you mentioned, I think it was it last time on Titanic about the high pitch of epic movies having to be simplified into good versus evil.
Yeah.
This comes to the point. Actually, are the Germans depicted too harshly in this movie? I mean, there's the scene where the guy gets stabbed. The pilot stabs him, and actually very clearly there's this kind of morality thing where the main character Schofield says, "Oh, let's put him out of his misery," and his friend Blake says, "Oh, get him some water. We'll look after him," and then he gets stabbed and dies subsequently.
Yeah. I that's actually my, that's one of the best movie, scenes in the movie, and again, should that have been a scene where they all shake hands and have a game of football in no man's land? Yeah, I mean, no, it shouldn't. On the other hand, I think this is why World War I is such a difficult subject to make films about anymore at 100-year plus remove. Where'd you go with this? It would be impossible to think in the 60s or 70s or even 80s of somebody making a movie like this, an adventurous yarn about World War One, almost mythologizing.
That's a very good point.
It was almost impossible to think in that way. Maybe it takes 100+ year remove for us to say, well, actually, there were stories of heroism. There were people who got, the George Cross, etc., the Victoria Cross, and very, very brave in what they did. It's difficult, isn't it? Because, we stand at a remove in history where we have World War II, where we have, if you like, with all the condescension of posterity, we have the goodie versus baddie definitive war there, perhaps, with all caveats included. To sort of go back and make an adventure movie of this, I still think it's a bit, I don't know, I found it a bit like tiresome and like the reviewer quoted earlier on, the filial, this is for my granddad and the stories he told, and fine, good, and all good Sam Mendes, but that's just my general opinion of this movie is
Yes. It sounds like something. It sounds like a contemporary person would say in this movie. Over the top. charging the machine guns with a stick and whistle. Actually, the point is, I haven't seen this point made by anyone. Maybe I've come up with it, maybe I haven't originally. But do you notice this movie? He starts. I think he's leaning on a tree at the start, and then at the end he goes down and leans on a tree again. And for me, what that meant was, I found the end of this movie is actually very upbeat, especially for a First World War One movie. He has those pictures of his family saying, "Come home to us." I actually find it quite an optimistic ending, but it's like this loop of suffering. I thought maybe that was the point of the movie, that it's like purgatory or something. You're suffering the whole time. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. He starts and ends leaning on relatively the same shot.
Purgatory is English bull terrier faced Benedict Cumberbatch telling you to f off for all eternity.
I'm not sure that when you're saying f off there, I'm not sure whether I'm going to have to bleep that or not, because it's your accent's so effective. I can't tell if it will be flagged on Apple Podcasts. I've got to say, before we move on to our questions, I want to have a shout out to great use of CGI in this movie, because as I always say in this podcast, the best use of CGI is when it's stitching things together in the background and you hardly notice it. It reminded me a lot of Children of Men. There's a few long shots and long 4 or 5 minute takes in Children of Men, the action sequences, and the CGI works in exactly the same way. So, Bryce, we're on to our questions. I've got 2 supplementary questions today. Number 1, couldn't they have used a pigeon? Did they even bother having to go through all the trouble? It's like a serious point, because there were like thousands of homing pigeons on the Western Front.
Well, again, that's the point here of the pigeon. Why not the pigeon? Why do we have to have human heroism? Doesn't World War One just destroy the notion of, without wanting to sound too nihilistic and cynical, of human heroism? Because in its essence, it's industrial, horrid slaughter. Haven't we, Sam Mendes, got beyond the notion of individual heroism by the time of World War One? For all the jingoism of the time, it just doesn't allow. The industrial slaughter of the Western Front doesn't allow for individual heroism. So why not the pigeon?
That's a very good point. And my second supplemental question is giving unpasteurized cow milk to a baby actually a good idea? I think you'll find it's actually terrible medical advice, and that baby would have died.
Well, that's a really I think
we weren't expecting. Maybe that's one for the sequel.
To come back to Alan Partridge, I think you've just done an accidental partridge there, but it's a very good accidental partridge. I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, brilliant. So, Bryce, what was your favourite scene? There's a few to choose from here. It's a very cinematic movie.
It has to be when the plane comes down.
Yeah, that was mine.
I don't think there's any other candidate really.
Yeah, I think that's fabulous.
Look, for all the problems I've picked up with this movie, look, that's a great scene. It's like you're reading a Commando novel, the little comic books, when the plane crashes down and he has a fight with the pilot. Yeah, I mean that has to be like the central scene, really.
It's really brilliant, that scene. And shout out to the color grading when the guy's face just goes white after he's been stabbed. It's brilliant. That is my favorite scene.
Very quickly goes white, doesn't it? It's just very tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I like flicking a switch. I also thought visually the ruined city, when he's walking through the ruined city at night, is incredible. I read that they maybe the largest ever lighting rig for the burning church in that scene, with 2 megawatts of energy used, that can power over 700,000 houses just to light that scene. But that scene's incredible, running through the city,
haunting.
And just when I thought this film was going to go into the unholy category of no women, not even extras, he stumbles across, of course, the lady and the baby in the house. So I'm glad to say it didn't.
It doesn't live up to Iranian Sniper in its complete removal of all the female species. No.
What was your favourite performance or character in this?
I think probably the Sikh soldier, just because it outraged Lawrence Fox and the other members of the Gamanage in the United Kingdom. Again, I think it's fairly reasonable to have a Sikh soldier there. There are plenty of them on the Western Front. 20% of the British Indian Army was Sikh, and the explanation makes enough sense to me in terms of the chaos of war. So it has to be that cameo for the tokenistic Sikh soldier for me. How about yourself?
Well, just a shout out. I thought George McKay, the main character, was great in this movie, and a shout out to the vein in his neck, because that is doing a lot of work to show how stressed he is.
Popping away.
He's got a great popping away. Yeah, he's got a great vein in his neck. Maybe he was cast because he had such a prominent vein in his neck. I would go with George McKay. I think the lead in this. Which historical figure should do the DVD commentary? Haig?
Yeah, maybe.
General Haig?
Butcher Haig.
Yeah.
Why?
Okay, so what's the best companion film? We have touched on a few. All Quiet on the Western Front, of course. I've only seen the original a very long time ago. I haven't seen the modern one, I must admit. It's on my list of films to watch. But from 1930, it's a great movie. And Paths of Glory, which is a fabulous movie by Stanley Kubrick.
I would agree. I think All Quiet on the Western Front, the recent one, which captures even more than the original, the sausage factory horror of the industrial destruction, futile destruction of young European manhood, which, of course, by nature, this movie, as you said, as an adventure movie, doesn't concern itself with already. So I think it's an important counterpoint to watch that movie, and I think the modern version of it actually is very good, because obviously more modern films probably don't hold back in some ways from their depiction, the unflinching depiction of, like I say, the sort of sausage meat-esque destruction. Is that
an anti-German slur?
No, not whatsoever. No. I mean, it's just the industrial horror of course not.
No. So, what did you give this out of 10?
I would give this film. Well, can I do a pedantry first of all?
Please.
We call it or pedantry corner.
Pedantry corner. Yeah.
The Western Front Association, who actually endorsed this movie, said, well, they did endorse it, but they also said, quote, "The depicted British units did not exactly fight at those particular coordinates. Furthermore..."
Oh, okay.
Benedict Cumberbatch's Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie of the 2nd Devons was in fact Colonel A.J.E. Sutherland. So I just have to...
I thought I found a pedantry corner, because there's a guy on the, you're talking about when the seat guy on the lorry. There's a guy there who says, "Welcome to the night bus to knows where." And I thought, 1917, surely night buses haven't been invented. Night buses for me means 4 o'clock in the morning, kebab, all the nightclubs are closed, got to get the night bus home. No. On 12:40 a.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of July, 1913, London's first night bus service began. So I've been out pedanted.
There you go. Don't doubt Sam Mendes. Yeah,
exactly. I did actually trawl through the British and Commonwealth Military Badge Forum to try and find something, but nothing. They all say it's spotless. So what would happen in the sequel if there was one, Bryce? 1918.
I look. It's very clear what the sequel is to this, isn't it? Which is the interwar period, depression, rise of fascism, and the horror of World War II. I'm not sure. What do you think in terms of a sequel?
Oh, I thought it would just be sitting around in a trench for a year and a half more, either between utter boredom and total terror, and maybe just copping one.
I'd have liked to have seen a bit more. Actually, one thing about this movie, I'd like to have seen a bit more smoking in this movie. There's quite a lot of smoking, but there should have been, I think, historical accuracy. People are getting their knickers in a twist about coordinates, while actually the level of smoking should have been up to a good deal in this. If we're going to be really accurate, because there was an awful lot of smoking going on, because there's an awful lot of boredom. World War One was not fun. World War One was not a ripping yarn like this. It wasn't adventurous. It was boring and horrific.
Would you put then? I actually thought he was carrying a cigarette case during this movie. The main character, is it, or is it just where the orders are? I'm a bit confused about that. What would you put in the Hall of Fame? The bucket of cow's milk? The blood-stained orders, maybe? Yeah.
Now that you've raised doubts about the nutritional value to infants of that pail of milk, I'll probably put the pail of milk, which of course was held up as a sort of sentimental flaw of the movie. One of the reviews I cited earlier on. I'd probably put the pail of milk in there, because what else are you going to put in there? What horrific instruments are you going to stick in there?
Bloated body or something. Not
eyes popping out in trenches and just I don't know what are you going to stick in there?
So that only leaves one question, Bryce. We have to come back to it. Marks out of 10. What did you give this movie?
Look, it's an experience, isn't it? And
yes,
it's a yarn. It's a ripping yarn. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10.
Well, I gave this an 8.5. And that's because I'm watching this. I enjoyed it, and I watched this purely as a cinematic experience. Yeah. And as I say, especially because I was expecting to be disappointed, I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was great. So, there we go. That was 1917. Well covered, I would say. So, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. That's it for this episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. Don't forget to leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. Spotify and Apple Podcasts make a huge difference to the algorithm. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to leave a comment or a like or subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.